Good evening, and thank you for joining us for a lively discussion about the U.S. elections and the future of populism. My name is Adam Ramey, and I'm Associate Professor and Program Head of Political Science here at NYU Abu Dhabi. I have the distinct pleasure of moderating tonight's program and introducing our distinguished speaker, Professor Francis Fukuyama at Stanford University. This evening's NYU Abu Dhabi Institute program is done in collaboration with the NYU DC Dialogue. As a result of the pandemic, tonight's program is, as you already know, virtual via Zoom. We are making use of the webinar format, and through that format, you have the ability to ask questions via the icon available on your screen. At the conclusion of Professor Fukuyama's talk, I will collate these questions and present them to him until the expiry of our time at 8 p.m. UAE time. These logistical details out of the way, allow me to introduce our speaker. Francis Fukuyama is the Olivier Nomellini Senior Fellow at Stanford University's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, Mosbacher Director of FSI's Center of Democracy Development and the Rule of Law, the Director of Stanford Master in International Policy Program, and Professor of Political Science. With his landmark essay, The End of History in 1989, and its 1992 book-length treatment, Professor Fukuyama's career thrust beyond academia into the policy world and everyday news cycle. In this work, coinciding with the end of the Cold War, he argued that then triumphant democracy was the end of a long-run evolution of a variety of forms of political order. It was the final form of government that represented the theoretical conclusion of mankind's search for the optimal system of governance. Beyond this work, he has authored no fewer than 24 monographs and books, along with dozens of articles and book chapters. His most recent manuscript, Identity, the Demand for Dignity and the Politics of Resentment, was published in 2018. In this work, Professor Fukuyama tackled the rise of identity politics, populism, and economic inequality across the globe. Indeed, with the elections of Donald Trump and Jair Bolsonaro, the passage of Brexit, the success of Poland's Law and Justice Party, not to mention the success of Islamist and Hindu nationalist parties throughout the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia, this work is especially timely. Today, Professor Fukuyama, undoubtedly informed by the arguments of this work, will speak to us about what next month's presidential election in the United States will tell us about the future of populism both in America and across the globe. And on that note, Francis, on behalf of the entire NYU community, I wish you the warmest welcome and thank you for joining us for this talk. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Francis Fukuyama.
So thank you very much. It's a very kind introduction, Adam. I'm really pleased to be able to speak to you. I've actually addressed audiences in, this would be my 6th country over the past week without leaving my desk. Normally I would be on airplanes nonstop, but such is the world we're living in. But I'm really glad actually to have this opportunity to speak to you, even if it's at this distance. So what I want to do is begin by talking a little bit about the world before COVID and some of the big political changes that had been happening, how COVID has affected those trends, and then spend some time, the American election now is less than 2 weeks away. If you live here in the US, it's very hard to get any conversation going that doesn't eventually come down to what the outcome will be. And so we will talk about that and what might be in store for both US domestic and foreign policy in the election's aftermath. So let me just begin by talking about global politics. We had experienced this long, what Samuel Huntington called the third wave of democratization that began in 1989. Well, no, I'm sorry, it really began in the early 1970s in Southern Europe. 1989 was, in a way, the midpoint, and it peaked sometime in the mid-2000s, in which the number of democracies expanded from around maybe 30 to 35 in the early 1970s to something well over 100 by the early 2000s. But over the last 10 to 15 years, we have been in what my colleague Larry Diamond has described as a democratic recession. He thinks now that we're moving more towards a depression condition. So you've had the rise of authoritarian states like Russia and China that are powerful and consolidated and projecting their influence increasingly. But I think more troubling to me is the rise of populist politicians within democratic countries, and the more general phenomenon of populist nationalism around the world. And as Adam mentioned, this is evident in the rise of the Law and Justice Party in Poland, Viktor Orban's Fidesz party in Hungary. Every European country now has a right-wing populist political party that's nipping at the heels of the mainstream center-left and center-right parties. But really, the revolution was kicked off by the Brexit vote in 2016 and Donald Trump's election as president of the United States. These were the two, among the two oldest and most established democracies. And the fact that a populist politician could rise to power, I think, was a surprise to me and to many other people. So we need to understand that phenomenon. I think that there are really two categories of explanation that have been put forward. The most common one is an economic explanation that has to do with globalization. We have been living up till now in a global, in a liberal international order. This order has permitted the free movement of trade, goods, people, investment across international borders. It yielded incredibly good results in the aggregate, so the global economy quadrupled in size between, let's say, 1970 and the early 2000s. But as I think many of us are aware, your trade theory class should tell you that the benefits of this kind of aggregate growth are not necessarily distributed evenly across countries. And in particular, working class people or less educated people in rich countries tended to lose jobs and opportunities to rising middle classes in places like India or China or Vietnam. And this has fueled a kind of resentment, especially in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis in the United States, where the disparities between elites that had done extremely well and continued to do well after the crisis was in sharp contrast to ordinary people in Europe and the United States that lost homes through failed mortgages, lost jobs, and the like. So that's, I think, conventional wisdom in many respects. But I think that there's another explanation that is actually more powerful and important, which is a cultural one. If economic motives were enough, if rising inequality were enough to explain the rise of populism, what you should have seen in this past decade is a rise of left-wing populism, because it's the left-wing parties that want to redistribute resources from rich to poor. But instead, what you saw was a rise of these right-wing nationalist and sometimes ethnically based political parties. And I think that the reason for that really lies in questions of identity. So what's identity? Identity means the feeling that I think every human being has, that they have a certain inner worth, that their inside is not what is necessarily recognized by the society around them. And they demand dignity, they demand respect, and it's linked very much to emotions rather than to reason. If you do not have that respect and that recognition, you feel angry, and that's what motivates people to go into politics. It's that kind of anger against disrespect. And I think that in many ways the economic and the cultural drivers of populism overlapped, because if you lose a job, you lose respect, you lose your status in the community, in your family, and particularly for, white male working class people in developed countries, that loss of status was particularly acute. And that, I think, has formed the social basis of populist movements in the United States, in Britain, but further afield as well. And, in Hungary or Turkey or other places where you've seen this kind of leader emerge, their voting base is sociologically quite different from the voting base of liberal politicians. It tends to be more conservative, more rural, people that come from second and third tier cities that have relatively lower degrees of education. And that's kind of the social divide that is facing us in one country after another. And I think it explains the reason that you've seen this right-wing form of populist nationalism. Now, I am a believer in liberal democracy, and I think that the rise of populism is particularly insidious because it tends to undermine not democracy so much as the liberal part of liberal democracy, because a liberal democracy is really, a set of different institutions. So you have the democratic ones that are free and fair multi-party elections that try to hold governments accountable. But you also have rule of law institutions. That's the liberal part of liberal democracy. And those mean rules that are generally agreed to, that are binding on everybody, including the most powerful political actors within a political system. And what's happened with the rise of these populist politicians is that they'll take their democratic legitimacy and use that to undermine the rule of law institutions in their societies. And we've seen this, repeatedly. So Viktor Orban in Hungary has attacked the courts. He's tilted the playing field in terms of free and fair elections. He's put the media under the control of himself or his cronies. And all of those have tended to weaken the kinds of checks that exist in a normal liberal democracy against concentrated executive power. Something similar has gone on in Poland, and this is something that Donald Trump has aspired to. He's not been entirely successful, but he's really attacked many of the check and balance institutions in the United States. So that includes his own Justice Department and FBI, the intelligence community, now the health bureaucracy. He's attacked the mainstream media as enemies of the American people. He's attacked judges and courts that have ruled against his favored policies. Many of these attacks have not been particularly effective, but the aspiration, I think, is very similar as with many other populist politicians. And so I think the crisis that we are facing today is less a crisis of democracy than a crisis of liberalism. But the two are really very intertwined because ultimately it's the liberal constitutional rule of law institutions that protect populations from elites and from the bad decisions of their political leaders. And so this was the world that we were facing. And I think, going beyond the US and Europe, it's been happening in a lot of places. So Jair Bolsonaro in Latin America was actually a new phenomenon. Latin America has had plenty of left-wing populists, like the Perones in Argentina, or Evo Morales in Bolivia, or Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. But Bolsonaro was a right-wing populist. He evinced many of the same themes. He was very, kind of racist in his remarks about black and brown Brazilians. And this is a new phenomenon in that region. Narendra Modi in India has been trying to shift India's national identity away from the liberal one that was established really with India's founding as an independent nation in the late 1940s to one based on Hindu nationalism with the passage of a citizenship law that made it very difficult for Muslims to attain citizenship. And so all of these are very negative kinds of trends that have been going on in the world over the past, I would say, at least decade prior to the rise of the COVID crisis. Now, what COVID has done in many ways is to accelerate some of these negative trends, because obviously you've got a virus that that crosses borders, and it justifies things like travel restrictions, restrictions on immigration. You know, immigration obviously is one of the big bugbears of populist politicians. They don't like foreigners, and they tend to blame foreigners for the domestic economic ills that their countries are suffering from. And you know, the virus gives people a perfect opportunity to reinforce those tendencies. I think that it's important to step back a little bit and understand actually what political and social and epidemiological characteristics really make it possible to fight the virus. Because I think there's been a certain amount of misinformation or, you know, too casual observation. One of the ideas that is out there is that authoritarian governments are better at controlling COVID than democratic ones. And I think that if you look statistically across the world, regime type is actually not that strongly correlated with effective COVID responses. I think that there are many countries that have done extremely well, that are democracies, in fact, have done better than China. I would say South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, Singapore have all been quite effective in controlling the virus. In fact, South Korea has been more effective than China. In Europe, you have Germany, you have a number of Scandinavian countries, you have Canada, New Zealand, and other Commonwealth countries. And so you find variance. You know, there's some very bad performers like Italy and Spain and the United States, but also some good ones. And among authoritarian countries, you find a similar variance. And so although China has managed to effectively lock down its population and control, you know, further outbreaks, that's also been happening in Asia's democracies. And so it really is not the presence or absence. I mean, democracy may have a role, which I'll get to, but I think in the first instance, that's not one of the most important characteristics. I think that if you think about the reasons for good performance, they lie in other domains. So some of them are institutional, and in particular, state capacity is very important. State capacity means whether you've got the public health authorities, you know, the doctors, the clinics, the health professionals, and then the resources to support them that make a difference in your ability to control the epidemic on a national scale. One of the reasons I think that a lot of countries in East Asia, regardless of whether they're authoritarian or democratic, have done well is that East Asia, of all the regions in the world, is one of the places that has emphasized state capacity. In a sense, that's one of the deepest cultural traditions of Chinese culture, is bureaucracy and the idea that bureaucrats should be well educated and expert. And in fact, you know, all of those countries in East Asia benefit from that tradition. They've got strong public health authorities. Many of them had actually suffered from the SARS epidemic previously, and therefore were well prepared when the virus hit. So that's obviously one of the explanatory factors. I think another factor really has to do with the behavioral characteristics of the country and a lot of the social attitudes that people hold. So one of them is trust. Obviously, if you distrust the government, you're not going to obey a mandate that is telling you to do difficult things like stay indoors or social distance or wear a mask. If you don't trust your fellow citizens, I think similarly, you're not going to cooperate with them in, again, doing measures that would be necessary in pandemic control. And this, I think, has been particularly a problem in the United States, where you have a political culture that is very anti-statist. This is probably one of the deepest characteristics of American political culture. The U.S. was born as a society that was rebelling against the concentrated political power of the British monarchy and parliament, and to this day you find libertarian or anti-statist attitudes very deeply embedded. So, traveling around Asia, I've had a repeated experience where you talk to people, colleagues that say, well, yes, the government has a lot of experts, they really know what they're doing, and we trust them to do the right thing. In the United States, you never hear this. And you particularly don't hear it on the American right, where distrust of government has been one of the largest drivers of political commitment. And that's led to, that's led to a failure of compliance that has divided along political lines. In addition, trust among Americans has deteriorated very badly. You're probably aware of the deep polarization in American society. And so mask wearing has become a political statement, unfortunately. It should not be, right? That people ought to wear masks depending on whether they judge this to be in the interest of public health. But in fact, not wearing a mask has become a sign of being a conservative, being a Trump supporter, and as a result, in red states, it's very hard to find people that go to these Trump rallies wearing masks or taking elementary precautions. And this is, by the way, a good illustration of what identity drives you to, because there's a kind of theory out there that people are rational, calculating individuals, and they calculate what's best for their personal well-being based on the available information, and then that's what determines their behavior. But I think that the social responses to the pandemic show that that's unfortunately not true for many people, that their primary goals are set by their kind of tribal identifications, whether they're on the right or on the left, whether they're red or blue, and that's what determines how they'll use their cognitive abilities to then justify doing things that are determined more by their political loyalties rather than what is rationally in their self-interest. We see lots of examples of this around the world where people actually act contrary to their self-interest, and that determines outcomes. And so that's clearly been happening in the pandemic. Then finally, you have a question of leadership. You can have high state capacity, you can actually have a relatively compliant society, but if you have a leader at the top that is giving out wrong advice, it's not going to make any difference. And I think that you've seen examples of this all over the world, and particularly among populist leaders, because you have Bolsonaro in Brazil, Manuel López Obrador in Mexico, and Donald Trump in the United States, who all three of whom really denied the existence of the virus and didn't take the measures necessary to prevent the spread of the epidemic. And as a result, Brazil, Mexico, and the United States have among the worst records of any country around the world. And so that is a factor that matters very much. Now, what's this going to mean for global politics going forward? I think actually, I should have started with a general warning that making long-term predictions about a major crisis like the one we're living through is a pretty dangerous game. and oftentimes we don't really see the long-term impacts for a number of years. But I think we're already beginning to see some of those impacts. So one of them is a shift towards East Asia, where this has been going on for some time, but today many countries in that region have actually returned to normal growth rates that they were experiencing before the pandemic hit, whereas Europe and the United States are both being hit by a second or possibly third wave that's going to hobble their economies well into 2021 or whenever a vaccine appears. I think that you've seen already this shift towards increasing authoritarianism, where many leaders have used the pandemic as an excuse to increase their executive authority. This happened first in Hungary, for example, where the Hungarian parliament granted Viktor Orban special emergency powers, but it's happened in El Salvador and Uganda. China, I don't think, would have extended its security law to Hong Kong the way it did this past winter, had it not been for the fact that the world was distracted by the COVID crisis, and they felt that the pushback against this wouldn't be particularly bad. We've seen this very interesting lag, I think, in the developing world in terms of the impacts, because, last winter, as the pandemic was spreading, the worst cases were all in rich countries. So that was Spain, Italy, the United States, to some extent France. And in sub-Saharan Africa or South Asia or Latin America, many countries imposed lockdowns, and it looked like the disease was not that bad in those regions. But all of that's changed, I think, since the summer, where I think the weak state capacity and the fact that in many developing countries, for example, a lot of workers are in the informal sector without access to benefits like health insurance, have started to lead to very deteriorated conditions. And so infection rates in all of those regions have been rising very rapidly. It proved not possible to maintain quarantines for extended periods of time. People needed to work. And I think that you're going to increasingly see a disparity between rich countries and poor countries, where, rich countries are continuing to deal with, the second waves of infections, but in the long run, the damage in poor countries will be really catastrophic in many cases, where they're going to lose an entire decade or 15 years of economic gains and see many people fall back into poverty. All right, let me now talk about the United States. I think that any big crisis like the COVID crisis we're experiencing now is actually both a big danger, but it's also an opportunity. The dangers are pretty obvious, and those are the ones that I just outlined. But there are also big opportunities that are presented. One thing about an epidemic is that the relationship between cause and effect becomes pretty clear to people. So if you have a leadership that's making very bad decisions or is incompetent, you pick that up much more quickly than in other areas of public policy. For example, in Belarus, there have been weekly demonstrations ever since the stolen election that by which Alexander Lukashenko, the dictator of that country, sought to stay in power. It's gone on now for 10 weeks, and I think one of the reasons that those demonstrations have been occurring is that he's another of those leaders that denied the impact of COVID. People could see that the government was responding incompetently, and that's one of the reasons that there's been a popular mobilization against him. And I think this is something that's weakening both AMLO in Mexico, Bolsonaro in Brazil. But the biggest impact is really going to be in the United States, I think, with Donald Trump. In January, I think most of the betting markets and the polling was showing that he had a pretty good chance of being reelected. The economy was doing well. Unemployment rates were at historically low levels. Wages for low-skilled workers had started to rise. And so, the overall economic record was not that bad. But the performance of the administration has been extremely poor dealing with the pandemic as a whole. And now, all of the poll results show that there's a double-digit gap, certainly in the national popular vote, but in all of the critical swing states where American elections are decided because of the Electoral College, Biden is ahead. And it's possible that not only will Biden win the election, but the Democrats will retake the Senate, so that it'll look like it did when Obama won in his first term in 2008, where you have unified Democratic control of both branches of Congress and of the presidency. Now, many Democrats are really worried about being overconfident because the polls showed that Hillary Clinton was similarly ahead in the 2016 election, and yet she lost. I think that there are reasons for thinking that the situation is quite different today. Back in 2016, first of all, many Republican voters were voting against Hillary rather than for Donald Trump. And Biden is simply not as unpopular as Hillary was. Then a lot of voters that voted for Trump, were willing to take a chance. They had doubts about him, but they thought the system needed to be shaken up, and that's why a lot of people who had voted for Obama on a similar basis in the two previous elections voted for Trump. I think at this point, there's hardly a single voter in the country that, still hasn't made up their mind as to whether they like or dislike Donald Trump. The polarization is so intense and the information overload is so great that it's, impossible really to be undecided. There's probably 3 voters that really don't have enough information to make up their minds at this point. And a lot of the early voting, because of the pandemic and because of the motivation that people have to vote, is really extraordinary. The number of mail-in ballots that have already been cast in the election is just through the roof compared to any previous presidential election. And so I think there's a reasonable chance that Trump will go down to defeat. There's a big question that many people have raised, whether the United States can actually hold a free and fair election. I think many Republicans realize that demographically their voter base is shrinking, and the only way they're going to hold on to power is basically by suppressing as many Democratic voters as possible, which they've done through a number of mechanisms like voter ID laws, gerrymandering, and the like. And that is continuing at a very loud level by the President Trump at the moment, who's tried to delegitimate all mail-in voting and claiming that if he loses, it can only be because of massive voter fraud. And one of the troubling things is that there's a high level of mobilization on the right. People are very angry and they're armed, and there have already been some incidents of violence by right-wing militias. And you have an administration that's calling on their supporters to go to polling places to watch for voter fraud and the like. So, I think if the results are decisive enough, hopefully we can avoid violence and a big meltdown. But there will certainly be lots of litigation. There already is a lot of litigation and disputes over the counting of ballots, which means that the outcome of the election may not be known for days and possibly even weeks after the election. Let me just finish on a couple of issues. If you do get a Biden presidency, what kind of changes can you expect? I think that Biden will face a lot of challenges because, the long-term problem of the United States is not going to go away. That problem is the deep polarization based on these identity issues. And he's going to inherit a country that's got an epidemic ongoing, that has an economic recession, and that's going to force him to pay a lot of attention to fixing both of those immediate problems. And he's got to do it relatively quickly because he does not want to repeat Obama's pattern in 2009, where he was elected with a big majority, but then immediately saw a Republican comeback 2 years later. The need for some kind of a leader that can really build a broad coalition, keep the splits within the Democratic Party from overwhelming his presidency will require quite a lot of political skill. I do think Biden is probably better positioned to do that than most people, or most candidates, but it is going to be a huge challenge. There are some areas, I think, where policy is not going to change very much. I think with regard to China, for example, there's been a big shift in attitudes on the part of the Democrats. And so although the tone will be not quite as incendiary as under the current administration, I'm not sure that there'll be a substantive change. But in general, I think that there will be an attempt to return to the kind of internationalism that characterized the United States for the preceding 70 years. I think that those countries around the world that depend on American support are going to be skeptical because they are going to see that the social polarization continues to exist. But I do think that a lot of countries will breathe a sigh of relief. I guess one final question to leave you with is whether this, if there is a Democratic victory, is the resulting United States going to look like the United States of 2008, where you have this continual flip-flopping between Democratic control and Republican control, which is what's been going on for the last 20 years, really? Or is there going to be a larger change? Will this be a so-called realigning election? Not to get too deep into American history, but in 1896, we had a realigning election where control flipped between the two parties virtually every 2 years in the previous 2 decades. But then in 1896, with the election of McKinley, the Republicans then took control of both houses of Congress and the presidency, and they held on to it for the next 16 years. And the social situation was in many ways similar, that in the late 19th century, the United States had to decide whether it was a rural, agrarian, kind of backward-looking society, or whether it was going to be an urban, industrial, open country. Voters could not decide for a long period, but all of a sudden, in that election, they made a choice in favor of the more modern version of America. And in a sense, that's the choice that we've been facing between the red states and blue states, or red America and blue America, is, what kind of America do we want in the face of a globalization that's opened up borders and moved people and so forth. And there's, at least a small possibility that this election could be the beginning of a broader realignment, because the demographic factors are all pushing in that direction, where, the Republican voter base of white voters, white, working class voters is shrinking fairly steadily, and the larger Democratic coalition is growing. I don't know whether that's going to be the case. It's probably not likely, because I do think that it will take, a longer time for that to happen, but it's a possibility we need to keep in mind. So with that, thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to any questions or discussion you might have. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for that perspective on both the globe and populism, and particularly on the U.S. toward the second end. We've got quite a lot of questions that have been popping up in the Q&A section, so we'll try to do our best to get through all of them. I think that the questions kind of boil down to one of two broad macro categories. Some focus on the U.S. and some focus more globally. Given that you just were talking about the U.S., I think it makes sense to kind of pick up there, and then we can go back and think more broadly about the populism in the rest of the world and where things are going from here. So one person, in our audience asks about the future of the Republican Party post Donald Trump. Indeed, sort of this right-wing populism that overtook the Republican Party by storm in 2016 with Donald Trump's winning the Republican nomination and subsequently the presidency, in many respects kind of drove a chasm between the sort of more traditional establishment wing of the Republican Party and this sort of Trumpy populist base. Do you think that this is going to hold up? In the event that, say, Donald Trump were to lose, and that indeed most of the polling and data, whether we look at the state level or national level, that's where things are pointing at this time. And if Trump were to lose, do you think that a populist Republican Party is here to stay, a la William Jennings Bryan and the realignment after 1896 that you talked about, or do you think that that there's a chance that the Republican Party might be able to shake off this populist tinge?
So based on the experience of a lot of parties that lose power, I think in general, it usually takes several election cycles, even after a catastrophic loss. It takes a few election cycles before it really sinks in that, their fundamental voter base and positions are really not viable in the long run. So I would not expect any rapid changes. I mean, Trump himself is not going to go away. I mean, if he assuming he peacefully leaves office, he's not going to fade into the background. He's going to be there as a vocal critic of whatever Joe Biden does. He's spawned a whole generation of imitators in the media and in the Republican Party that are going to keep up a kind of relentless barrage of criticism. So I think that's in that sense, that's not going to go away. One of the factors I didn't talk about, but I think is very important, has to do with the media environment that we face right now, because that's really one of the things that's changed very much from previous decades. With the rise of social media and the internet, it's basically taken away all of the intermediaries that used to do fact checking and supervise editorial content, so anyone can say anything. And it's just been amazing to watch the rise of QAnon, this conspiracy theory that I would say a year ago was just the property of a really fringe group of people. But there's some more recent poll data that's showing that a majority of Republicans believe some version of this conspiracy theory. And, it's a very extreme theory. I mean, there are tunnels under Washington, D.C., where the Democrats are holding children in order to cannibalize them and drink their blood. And, it's all being orchestrated by George Soros and this sort of thing. Now, one of the reasons it's spreading is that the president himself has been encouraging it. I mean, it's just kind of a mind-boggling idea that you could have a person with that kind of authority and importance that would actually support this kind of extreme, nutty, just completely off the charts idea. But, that's the kind of world we're living in, where the internet has allowed anybody to say anything. And therefore, the two sides are getting very, very different portrayals of reality. And that's not going to change once if the Democrats win in November. So all of that suggests that, the problem is going to stay there. I would say on the other side, there is this big problem that the Republicans have, as I said, with their shrinking demographic base. In a way, they had a choice, after the loss to Obama, where a lot of the more liberal parts of the party said, we need to appeal to a broader base of people. It can't just be white working class, angry people. It's got to include Hispanics and women and more educated professionals and that sort of thing. And that just completely got shut down. And Trump kind of represents the negation of that strategy. But in the long run, I think it's the only way that that party is going to survive. I mean, right now they're reduced to basically a voter suppression strategy as the way to stay in power. And that's just not a healthy, resource to lean on. And so, one thing I think that's interesting, it's just interesting fact out there, is that I think there are now up to 9 or 10 Republican former governors that have endorsed Biden. Very few elected officials. I mean, I think virtually no elected officials have done that, but those that are out of office have expressed a pretty clear skepticism for where the party is going. And that indicates that maybe down the road there'll be at least the nucleus of a more liberal Republican Party. They'll be shouted down, I think, in the immediate aftermath of the election. But I do think that there is a nucleus that may grow over time. So I think that's kind of where the party is right now.
And sort of thinking about the Democratic side of the equation, again, sort of, Biden is certainly, he is a centrist within the broader Democratic Party coalition. But thinking about a Biden presidency, certainly there is a more populist wing of the Democratic Party with the AOC, Bernie wing of the party. If Biden were to enter office, I mean, do you see a sort of a resurgent left-wing populism coming from that crowd in
sure.
politics?
Yeah, no, that's obviously going to happen. I think that, many people in the progressive wing of the party have been holding their noses and supporting Biden. He was really not their first choice at all, but I think they kind of see the necessity of defeating Trump, and so, they've jumped on his bandwagon. But I think the moment that he wins, and particularly if they retake the Senate and really get control of the government as a whole, they're going to want to take control of the agenda. Whether they'll be able to is, well, I mean, it's going to depend on the extent of the election victory and who gets elected and so forth. But, I think that it's still going to be really, really difficult, even with a big landslide, for the Democrats to govern from that kind of a left-wing position. I think that you'll still need, some degree of Republican support. And so I think, what Biden is clearly hoping to do is to be able to peel off, to get a majority in the Senate, and then to be able to peel off, maybe 3 or 4 or 5 Republican senators so that they can actually pass real legislation on a stimulus, on health care, on other sorts of things. But it's going to be a real fight, and I think the criticisms of Biden for not doing enough and actually for being bipartisan are going to accelerate and get very loud if the Democrats win.
And one of the things that you touched on in your talk was this idea that and Trump made this offhand remark a few weeks back about when asked about peaceful transition of power, and kind of gave these sort of vague musings. Oh, well, if the election is fair, and so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. Do what chances do you see of, so say Trump were to lose, of him actually trying to refuse to concede, and what implications do you think that would have for American politics and for liberal democracy more broadly?
Well, they're all bad. It wasn't just one offhand remark. I mean, he's been virtually saying every single day for the last 3 or 4 months that he expects that if he loses, that the election will have been affected by massive voter fraud, that essentially all mail-in ballots are illegitimate and that, they shouldn't be counted after election day and so on and so forth. And so he's clearly anticipating, the possibility that he'll lose, and he is definitely keeping open the option of contesting the election's legitimacy. And already, there's something like more than 200 lawsuits in the different states, because once the election happens, all the action moves from the federal government to the states and the state electoral commissions. And so there's just been a raft of lawsuits where mostly Republicans are challenging, the legitimacy of mail-in voting procedures. The Supreme Court just yesterday decided against, a Republican effort to prevent Pennsylvania from counting votes past election day. But, especially in the swing states, there are many, many legal actions like this, many of which are still undecided. And so the courts will immediately get dragged into this. If it's a close election, the situation gets really complicated and potentially could lead to a constitutional crisis because there are a number of swing states like Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, where you have Democratic governors and Republican legislatures. The laws, the last time we had a really contested election was 1876 in the Tilden Hayes election, where the winner was not picked, until like 3 days before the inauguration. And, you could get a repeat of some of those issues where the states cannot decide on a slate of electors, and, the Republican legislature and the Democratic governor will send competing slates to be counted. And then the courts will have to step in and try to decide which one is legitimate. And, people will be out in the streets, demonstrating for and against and so forth. And so you can really spin out an extremely messy scenario. I think most people think that if the voting goes very, very heavily against the Republicans, that we might be able to avoid this. But, Pennsylvania, for example, is, I think, likely to see a blue wave. I mean, they're not allowed to even start counting mail-in ballots until Election Day. There's been an extraordinary surge of mail-in ballots that have already been sent in. And I think there it's pretty clear that on Election Day, Trump will do better, or is likely to do much better than Biden. But as these mail-in ballots are counted, in now, I guess they've got 3 days after Election Day, the result may swing from Trump to Biden. And, that's really where you'll get these loud protests, especially from the president, that this is, the result of voter fraud and so forth. So I think, there's lots of very worrisome scenarios by which we would not be able to actually decide the election cleanly, and in which there could, actually be a breakdown of the process, a constitutional confrontation, violence, all sorts of things.
No, that certainly would not be pretty and would be very detrimental to institutions within the U.S. and certainly to the U.S.'s image abroad. Coming back to this this idea about right-wing populism and left-wing populism, and so I think one of the most striking things is that Trump was able to essentially take over the Republican Party in a relatively short span of time, and the messaging and the whether it's on trade or immigration or foreign policy or what have you, Republican elites have kind of followed in lockstep. And then you've got Joe Biden winning the Democratic primary pretty handily, and then choosing as his vice presidential nominee Kamala Harris, who and sidestepping the more populist wing of the Democratic Party, folks like Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders. What do you take of this? Why didn't Biden go with somebody who was of that more populist, left-wing populist ilk?
Oh, I think it was a strategic calculation that at the moment that he chose Kamala Harris, he was already well ahead in the polls. I think that he figured that he could probably take for granted a lot of the progressive vote, voting for him, because those people, although they didn't necessarily like him, really hated Trump and therefore would be motivated to go and vote. Unfortunately, American elections are not determined by the popular vote. They're determined by the Electoral College. And in Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, states like that, a very liberal vice presidential candidate is just not going to fly. So I think it was a very sensible strategic calculation. But that just means that the potential unhappiness on the left wing of the Democratic Party is all going to come pouring out, once he actually does become president.
All right, and sort of thinking a little bit more globally at the moment. So let's again, follow conventional wisdom, though. As you've noted, this is a different election than 2016, but I remember 4 years ago doing an NYU Abu Dhabi Institute event, and everyone seemed pretty sure that Trump was going down in that election too. So, but let's just imagine the conventional wisdom is true, and Trump loses, and Biden takes office in January. What do you think that's going to do to sort of right-wing populism globally? Is it going to stall the momentum that movement's gained in recent years? What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, so I think that global populism has been in trouble ever since the beginning of the epidemic. It's very interesting, for example, in Germany. And actually, this is a broader pattern that should give people a little bit of hope that effective governance actually can reverse cynicism and build trust and support. Angela Merkel, faced a populist uprising from the AfD, from the Alternative for Germany party, that was very similar to, the populisms in other places. But because of her relatively successful handling of the COVID crisis, she's seen her poll numbers rise, pretty substantially. And the AfD, by contrast, has really lost a lot of support. In Mexico and Brazil, I think, those populist presidents have come under a lot of criticism and pressure. They've seen their poll numbers fall. Bolsonaro has managed to save himself for the time being because he's supported this extremely generous cash handout program that has convinced a lot of poor Brazilians that he's okay. But still, he's facing a lot of headwinds. And so, and one other, interesting example that just happened is Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, where, again, you had a very liberal politician who, led a very effective COVID response. And her party now has won a majority in the parliament, which under their voting system has really never happened ever since they adopted this mixed member proportional system. And so I think that, a big loss by Trump in the election is going to deflate the sails of a lot of populists around the world. But, these movements are driven by, a lot of other factors other than imitation of one another. And so in India, for example, Modi really doesn't depend on kind of outside encouragement from fellow populists around the world. He's, riding his own kind of internal wave of social support. But certainly Europe is going to pay a lot of attention to what goes on in the United States, and it will have a significant effect.
And sort of staying on this sort of global conversation, thinking about, you talked, both of us mentioned toward the beginning, the sort of Law and Justice Party in Poland, and sort of Poland's an interesting case. You think about going back to the end of the Cold War, the Solidarity movement was so active in sort of helping to bring down the communist regime and opening up Poland to the West and to a more pluralistic society. What happened? Why do you think Poland embraced this sort of this populist approach to politics and eroding democratic institutions? What happened?
So first of all, so it's a puzzle because Poland was the single most successful EU country in the decade preceding the rise of the Law and Justice Party. And that's, further evidence that it's really not the economics that's been driving the rise of populism. It's also one of the most ethnically homogeneous countries. They did not take a lot of migrants from Syria during the Syrian refugee crisis. There are really virtually no important minorities, either religious or ethnic, in that country. And so there are not a lot of pre-existing cleavages that a populist could build on, as race has been a big issue here in the United States. So that actually deepens the puzzle that you've suggested. I think that if you look at the voting base of the Law and Justice Party versus the voting base of the liberal parties, you do see a very similar kind of cleavage where the Law and Justice Party draws from people that live in small towns, in rural areas outside of Warsaw and the bigger Polish cities. I think that many of the liberal elites that had really run Poland since the transition to democracy in the 1990s, had really lost touch with a lot of those people. It turns out that gay marriage and LGBTQ rights, we saw gay marriage being legalized in one country after another in this extraordinarily short period of time. And everybody patted themselves on the back and said, people really have accepted this and become much more tolerant. But I think actually that wasn't the case, that this was something that was being pushed by liberals in countries like Poland. And there actually was a lot of unarticulated resistance to that that has now been articulated by these right-wing parties. So Duda, the guy that came out on top in the last Polish election, said that basically, LGBTQ rights they're worse than communism, or gay marriage is worse than communism, as a threat to Christian values and to traditional, Polish identity. And that shows that, I don't know, it's a strange thing because Poland is now highly polarized between, these social conservatives and the liberals in a country that really, as I said, had no prior social cleavages. And I think it just shows that human beings really like to sign up for teams. That once one of these cleavages gets going, it becomes part of your identity. And in this case, it really focused on these kinds of conservative values about the family and about the role of the Catholic Church and so forth. So that's about as good as I can do in explaining that. Plus, one other two lessons for liberals. So one is that I do think that, as in many other countries, a lot of the liberals in Warsaw were really out of touch. They just didn't perceive what was going on among their fellow countrymen that didn't live in big urban agglomeration. And the other thing had to do with so-called neoliberal economic policies, because one of the things that's actually been very important for the Law and Justice Party's popularity is this family subsidy that they implemented. That had been rejected by the previous centrist government as too expensive. And the Law and Justice Party now gives a pretty hefty subsidy. The more children you have, the bigger your subsidy that It really helps out a lot of struggling families, and that's turned out to be wildly popular in that country. And that's one way in which the new right differs from the old right. You know, the old right was kind of Thatcherite or Reaganite. They didn't like government spending on social programs, but this new right is perfectly comfortable with that. And you know, the Polish party is one example.
And just sort of thinking a little bit more broadly here, I mean, the fact that we've seen this populism emerge across so many different countries and so many different contexts, you know, it suggests some degree of universality that despite the fact you have different local political circumstances, there's something there. And you know, do you think that this, and indeed, it's not the first time in the last century that we've seen the rise of this sort of populism, though the nature of it is certainly a bit different. But that raises a question of, is this sort of populism or this sort of populist type moment something inevitable to our political order?
You know, I actually wrote a kind of extended essay called Liberalism and Its Discontents, which I published. I started a new magazine called American Purpose a couple of weeks ago, which you can find the essay there, you know, talking about the strengths and weaknesses of liberalism. So liberalism basically is a mechanism for governing over diversity. It really emerged in the 17th century after the wars of religion in Europe, where, you know, liberals said, look, we're killing each other over whether we're Protestant or Catholic, so let's just put that into private life, you know, take it out of contention. The society is not going to focus on the good life, it's just going to focus on a basic set of rules that will allow us to coexist. And that's been the strongest argument for liberalism ever since, that if you have diverse societies in which you cannot agree on strong forms of community, liberalism is the solution, because it's a kind of live and let live, you know, set of rules that permit a peaceful resolution of disputes over these deep issues. The problem with liberalism has always been the same, that people want this feeling of community. They want strong ties. They want to be bonded with other people. That bonding can be on the basis of shared religious beliefs. It can be on the basis of shared ethnicity, culture, language. You know, that's what nationalism is all about. And so the challengers to liberalism have always made a kind of similar pitch, you know, that liberal society tolerates everything. You know, we believe in, you know, X, you know, that's really the basis of our national identity, or that's who we as a people really are. And the people that don't believe in X or aren't X, you know, we need to exclude them from our, you know, from our community. So that human longing for strong ties and bonding with people similar to themselves has, you know, always kind of been the enemy, I think, of liberalism. You know, there's one of these right-wing critics of liberalism in the recent debate, you know, just in the past year, that made a remark that, you know, liberalism is kind of thin gruel, you know, that basically anything goes in a liberal society, and people want something more than that. So I think, for example, in Eastern Europe, when people were living under a communist dictatorship, they really didn't like it. They hated, you know, not having any personal individual freedom. And so they all celebrated when the communist dictatorships fell in 1989 or 1991, and they, you know, and they enjoyed this newfound ability to say and think, you know, whatever they wanted. But over time, I think they started taking that for granted. You know, that just seemed like a normal condition. Of course, we can say whatever we want. What I actually don't like is the European Union telling me that I have to label my food a certain way, or that I have to let refugees in, or, you know, some other thing that they didn't like. And, you know, that then turned them towards politicians that were offering this stronger form of community. And by the way, that happens on the left as well. I mean, I think a lot of contemporary identity politics on the left are people saying, look, we want social justice. We want equality for African Americans, for women, for gays and lesbians. And, you're compromising liberal politics, your bipartisanship isn't getting us to where we need to go. We need to go a lot faster. And therefore, there's a lot of pressure to, suspend liberal rules in favor of things that are much more decisive. And so that, I think, is kind of the general problem with liberal politics. It's slow, it's consensus-based, it has to tolerate lots of views that you really don't like or find repugnant, and that, isn't satisfying to a lot of people.
And that kind of naturally follows into another question that's come up, and several people in the chat box have asked about it, is sort of what can liberalism do sort of as an effective response to this threat that's posed by this populist moment? I mean, is it just a matter of kind of waiting it out and let it fizzle out? I mean, you kind of already alluded to the fact that poor handling of the coronavirus situation is leading many populists, the populist movements that had been successful around the world, to be suffering in the polls in their respective countries. But is it good enough to just wait it out, or what should the sort of defenders of liberal democracy do in the wake of this moment?
Well, there's several things. So obviously, effective governance is a pretty good advertisement for a liberal politician. So you want to do that. I think that national identity actually remains a very important issue, and that's something that many liberals don't understand. I mean, liberalism itself is a kind of universalist doctrine. Liberals don't believe in rights for Americans or rights for Englishmen. They believe in human rights, and in theory, they are just as concerned with a human rights violation in Bangladesh or Uganda as they are in their own country. And so there's been a tendency to downplay, patriotism and national identity. But in my view, you have to have national identity if you're going to have a successful democracy. I mean, national identity is basically a common shared set of narratives and values about the legitimacy of your own institutions and society. If you don't have that, if there's fundamental disagreement on their legitimacy, then I think you end up like Bosnia or Iraq or Syria, where you essentially have these communities that are all living side by side, but they really don't feel that they've got anything in common. And in the extreme form, it leads to political breakdown, as it did in Syria. But the national identity needs to be democratic, and it needs to be liberal. It needs to be built around political values rather than around race or ethnicity or religion, because those three characteristics are fixed at birth for the large part, and they exclude people in diverse societies that don't share, the race, ethnicity, or religion of the dominant group. And so, to the extent that there's national identity, it's got to be based on political values, like the value of democracy itself, or like the value of individual freedom and equality. And I think that emphasizing the right kind of national identity is important. In my book, Identity, I give this example of that's portrayed in the film Invictus, which is about the 1996 Rugby World Cup game that was held in the newly democratized South Africa. And, Morgan Freeman plays Nelson Mandela, who, so the blacks played soccer and the whites played rugby in South Africa. And they were hosting the Rugby World Cup. And Nelson Mandela took it on himself to convince his fellow black South Africans to support the Springboks, which was the almost all-white national rugby team, which met a lot of resistance from, his fellow black members of the African National Congress. But I think that that's what it means to build a national identity, around kind of shared values. In this case, the shared value is sports, which actually for most people is a hugely emotional form of attachment. But I think that that's a good example of what a leader can try to do to build solidarity on a broad basis and not simply feed an existing polarization in a society. There's other things that countries can try. I think national service. I really like the idea of national service. I think that countries like South Korea or Israel that have mandatory national service, military service, benefit from that, but I don't think it needs to be military. I think there can be forms of civilian service that could serve. So there's other things I think, that can be done to build a kind, overcome polarization and work towards a kind of greater sense of shared citizenship.
All right, and I think the sort of the last collection of questions that we've got here largely focus on sort of the internet backing out from specific cases and thinking about the global order and what the implications for this moment are on the international order. And so, one of our audience members asked about the role of populism, particularly in the European context, places like Hungary and the UK. Thinking about Brexit and so on, about the future of European integration. Regardless of whether these parties stick around for a while, and certainly some will be around longer than others from country to country. What do you think is going to happen in terms of European integration as a consequence of the populism that we witnessed in the recent past couple of years?
Well, I don't think that the European project is going to move significantly towards greater federalism, meaning greater, stronger pan-European institutions, because I just think that what both the Euro crisis and the migrant crisis demonstrated is that the loyalties to your particular nation state really trump, that kind of broad solidarity. But I think the EU did a lot better in the COVID crisis than it did in the Euro crisis. There was an agreement over the summer led by France and Germany to float Eurobonds for the first time in the EU's history, and then to use those funds to subsidize basically the stronger Northern European states would be subsidizing the weaker Southern European states. That was a conspicuous failure during the Euro crisis, when basically Germany and Denmark and Finland all said, hell no, we're not going to send any of our tax dollars to Greece and Italy. It's their fault that they're in this problem. It's not our responsibility. And I think, a lot of European leaders, particularly in Germany, and I'd give Angela Merkel credit for this, realized that that was a big mistake and that there has to be more flexibility and more solidarity across Europe. Now, the current problem has shifted from being a north-south problem to being an east-west problem, because Eastern Europe has started to go off in this separate direction. So you now have these populist parties in Poland and Hungary, and actually the disbursement of those Eurobond monies is being held up over a dispute as to whether they should actually go to Poland and Hungary. I'm not a European, so I don't have a right to take a position on this, but if I were a European, I would put conditions on this money, because I think especially Hungary has really violated some extremely basic European democratic norms, in the way it's treated its judiciary, in the way it's treated the media, in all sorts of respects. And they should not get a pass on this, which they've been getting up till now because of their importance, in the European Parliament. And so I would think that, before you get any of this bailout money from the EU, you've got to meet certain basic conditions of democratic governance. But the problem is they're sort of stuck in this position where the very countries that are violating these rules also have the power to veto decisions by the EU itself. And this is one of the structural weaknesses, that the EU is very strong in certain areas having to do with regulation and product labeling and so forth, but it's extremely weak in other places, which has to do with fiscal policy and foreign policy, where any one of the member states can veto a decision by the collectivity. And so, I think within the constraints imposed by that rather awkward structure, they've done reasonably well, but they're still hobbled by that structure. For example, they really can't criticize China for anything right now because a number of Eastern European countries are getting, investments as part of China's Belt and Road Initiative, and they don't want to antagonize China, and so therefore the EU can't criticize what's going on with the Uyghurs or, human rights or the South China Sea or anything else. So that, again, I think demonstrates kind of the limits of European decision-making right now.
And in thinking about the international system, so during the Cold War period, we essentially had this bipolar world, the sort of the U.S. and its Western liberal democratic allies on one side, the Soviet Union and its Warsaw Pact and affiliates on the other side. And then, of course, with the fall of communism, you have this, for lack of a better word, unipolar world, centered around the U.S. Keeping the peace and throughout the world. But of course, the aftermath of the Iraq War and the financial crisis, the U.S. has been, since the Obama administration and bleeding into the Trump administration, been increasingly kind of stepping away from its role as sort of this global hegemon. And so where do you think this is going in terms of the international system? Are we headed toward a multipolar world or sort of worlds where there's sort of clusters of powers, or what do you see as the future of the international system here?
Yeah, I think in the 2010s, it kind of looked like we were heading towards a multipolar world in which the US, Europe, Russia, China, Brazil, South Africa, all would be kind of independent power centers. And that would be a kind of more normal distribution of power in the international system. I think today it looks increasingly bipolar. I don't think we're going to get back to the strict bipolarity of the Cold War, but it is going to be much more bipolar because, Russia and China have really, consolidated as authoritarian countries, and they cooperate a lot. They vote together in the Security Council. They oppose the same kinds of, things like, the demonstrations in Belarus and so forth. I think that many Europeans have been kidding themselves that they can be an independent power center that will sometimes align with China, will kind of soften the American approach towards Russia, and they can just be kind of floating out there in a real multipolar situation. I just think that doesn't work. I think that, and one of the big drivers of this is Chinese behavior and what's been going on in China, because ever since Xi Jinping became the party general secretary in 2013, China has been moving backwards into being, a totalitarian regime where the Chinese Communist Party wants to exercise complete control over the entire society. And it's doing it in a way and with new technology that enables it to create a surveillance state of a sort that we've never seen in human history before. And I just think that, that project is so at variance with European democratic values that, it's just not acceptable for a European country to say, well, on the one hand, there's China, we don't like what they're doing with the Uyghurs, but on the other hand, there's America, and we don't like, racism in America. They're just not comparable, and particularly if the Democrats, come back into power and reassert a kind of international role for the United States, I think it will be very wrong to take that position. You see this, I think now in something like the Huawei controversy, where a year ago, a lot of European countries were seriously considering letting Huawei build their 5G infrastructure. But I think that as time has gone on, the Trump administration didn't help things by being so crude and vocal in their anti-Chinese rhetoric. I think they actually hurt their cause more than they helped it by doing that. But I think nonetheless, there are a lot of European countries that are now kind of reconsidering whether they're going to allow this piece of critical infrastructure to be built by a company from a country that really does not share their most basic democratic values. So that's why I think that we are going to be in a more bipolar world. It's not going to be the world of the Cold War, but it's unfortunately not going to be this, really multipolar world that you might have expected back in the 1990s or the 2000s.
Great. And one final question, and this one is, I think it's intriguing partly because of the sheer possibilities with which you could answer. What worries you the most? Sort of thinking back on all of your observations of the international order and the politics, of in the U.S.'s interconnection with it, going back to the Cold War, the period after, then of course the current moment that we live in. What worries you the most going forward from here?
It's hard to choose because there's a lot of things that are very worrisome right now, and they're all interconnected with one another. I suppose that probably one of the most worrisome things is really this cognitive issue about how technology has really destroyed a kind of cognitive consensus, not just about policies and interpretations, but about basic facts. Most disruptive technological change has provoked, methods of regulating the technology and reducing the harms, and I think that will happen in the case of the internet and information technology. But I do think, that's something that's quite worrisome. Down the road, I wrote a book in 2001 called Our Post-Human Future, because I believed then, and I still believe, that in the end, biotechnology is going to be just as threatening to basic human values because it's capable of changing people at a much more fundamental level. It's just that, we haven't seen that play out fully, but I would imagine that that's going to happen in the next generation. So, those two poles of technology, I think, present a lot of dangers to our current political order, and I would worry about both of them.
Thank you very much for your thoughts there, and it's a timely topic given the United States election coming up so soon. Talking about the implications of populism on the both domestic and international arena, and thinking about things globally going forward. I want to thank Francis Fukuyama of Stanford University for speaking and participating in this dialogue tonight. I want to thank all of you. There were more than 300 participants who logged in to listen to this talk. I want to thank the NYU Abu Dhabi Institute and its partner, the NYU DC Dialogues, for sponsoring this event. And I wish you all a safe and prosperous rest of your year. And let's hope for the best with respect to liberal democratic institutions.
Okay. Thank you very much for having me. Bye-bye.